Hi everyone, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of NAPCAN's National Child Protection Week webinar series. Unfortunately, today we don't have our videos working, so it will be the launch of a NAPCAN podcast series. We do have all our fabulous panelists with us today though, so I hope you'll all stay on and join the conversation. I believe you can still send questions through, and I'd be really keen to hear from all of you throughout the session. So welcome again. I'm Rani Kumar. I'm the Deputy CEO of NAPCAN, and I've been given the responsibility to guide you through this important conversation. Today, the conversation is really about keeping kids in the picture, how family violence hurts children too. In this discussion, we'll be exploring the impacts of experiencing or being exposed to family and domestic violence and what that means for children. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the beautiful land on which I'm today. I'm on the lands of the Jannawi people here in the capital in Canberra, and it's land that was never ceded. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and extend that to all the elders from the lands from which you may be watching today, and to extend that respect to Aboriginal colleagues that are logged on today as well. It's really important to us at NAPCAN to also acknowledge the children, because that's what this week is about and where culture will live on. If you're not familiar with GoToWebinars, I'll just quickly tell you a few things about it. It's a little bit fiddly. The control panel's on the right-hand side for all of you normally, but it does move around a bit. If you lose us, there's a snowflake sort of symbol on the bottom that will bring you back to us straight away, and you can pop in questions through the question function that's on that control panel. It's a grey little space where you can type in your questions and send it straight through to the organisers, who will make sure that they get to me. If you run into any technical issues, more so than we already have, please ring the NAPCAN team, whose contact details are in the chat function, and any relevant handouts and links will also be posted in that function. So if you need something, just shout out and we'll be able to help you out. This will be recorded and be posted on our website in due course, along with a resource sheet that will capture some of the key insights and any links from the discussion today. But it'll also be emailed to anyone who is registered, so you don't need to check back on the website. It'll come direct to you. So to get into it, we're here today as part of 2023's Child Protection Week. National Child Protection Week is really about sharing the message that every child in every community needs a fair go. This year, we also focused on the theme, Where We Start Matters. And yesterday, at the launch of Child Protection Week at Admiralty House in Sydney, NAPCAN launched a call for action for the Commonwealth Government to convene a national summit to prevent child maltreatment. You can hop onto our website and have a look at some of the details around that, or contact us directly to have a chat about this call if you're interested. We, along with some eminent thinkers from the sector, have been having these conversations about prevention for a while. And on the back of the release of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study that came out earlier this year, we know that we can't look away and hope for things to improve. We need to stop doing the same thing and expecting a different result. We need a fresh way of looking at prevention of harm. And we need this action at a national level now. We need to make the safety and wellbeing of children a national priority. So we know where we start matters, and we think that this summit is a place we should start. Bring together diverse perspectives, experts, and those with lived experience to build a new path that focuses on preventing harm before it occurs. So do go to our website and find out more about getting involved. But of course, where we start isn't where we finish. We invite you to use this theme to explore and talk about the many ways that where we start matters for the children, young people, and families that you work with. Now, today's discussion is about family and domestic violence and how it impacts children. In this discussion, we're going to explore the impacts of experiencing or being exposed to family and domestic violence and what that means for children now and in the future. While Australia has been having a deeper look at violence against women and shedding more light on what is needed to prevent it, we need to make sure we keep kids in the picture. The new national plan to prevent violence against women and children is a positive step forward, but we know children experience violence in the home differently to adults, and that these experiences shape future relationships and health outcomes. Our presenters today will discuss how we keep prevention of harm to children a priority in the family and domestic violence space. I do want to note, though, that some of the topics and content we cover today may be sensitive or a bit difficult or upsetting. Please look out for yourself, and remember, it's okay to switch us off for a bit, mute us, step away if you need. And when you're feeling ready, you can come back and join us, or there's some contact details of services and helplines that are available for support if you need it. Don't hesitate to reach out. So let's get into it. We have first up Jess Hill. Jess is a journalist, an author and a speaker who has been advocating on behalf of children and victim survivors of domestic and family violence for almost 2 decades. It was her first book, See What You Made Me Do, exploring the phenomenon of domestic abuse and coercive control, that saw her awarded the 2020 Stella Prize. This was then adapted into a 3-part investigative journalist series on SBS. And maybe some of you have seen it as the Asking for It SBS doco series about consent and sexual assault. Jess has also spoken at hundreds of events about coercive control and consent, and she regularly conducts training, which is really critical for groups that are diverse, such as magistrates, high school students, and local councils, getting different people involved in this conversation. So over to you, Jess, to share a bit about what keeping kids in the picture for domestic and family violence means and the work that you've been doing.
Thank you so much, Rani, and hi everybody. I'm coming to you from Gadigal country, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people on this call. I started really looking at this issue and kind of got stuck here in 2014, and actually Moo was one of the first people that I met when I first started investigating this, and we've known each other a long time now. And I most recently, I guess I've been starting to think about how we not only put children in the picture in terms of family violence, but really how we devote more resources to children who have grown up around coercive control and family violence. And I think if we look at the personal safety survey, you can see the prevalence of this is so high. We've got around more than 1 million children who are affected by domestic violence. And I think the child maltreatment study showed even more concerning statistics in terms of the current crop of children who are being exposed to what they called emotional abuse. So I think, you know, probably if we don't look for physical violence particularly, and we start looking more broadly at coercive control, we would see that number increase probably to around 1 in 3. And in 65% of family violence incidents that were recorded by police in Victoria, there were kids in the home. And I always think it's really interesting that we use the term women's refuges when in fact there are actually many more children in refuges than there are women. And even though really this whole period of enhanced awareness, and a period that I've sort of described in my writing as the scales coming off the nation's eyes, that really started with the murder of Luke Batty and the advocacy of Rosie Batty. You know, that started with the murder of a child, and yet our focus just hasn't quite switched on to the threat to children, both of violence and of coercive control as they grow older. So coercive control, just briefly, it's not a new area of study, but I think it's only really been in the last couple of years, or really since about 2020, that the general public and the people running our systems have started to really understand what it looks and feels like. And so what we're sort of now all starting to understand is really something that victim survivors have been saying and the domestic violence sector has understood since the first refuges opened in the 70s. And that is that more often than not, you know, the abuse, coercive control abuse in these intimate relationships and families is following a plot line that is so predictable that once you've heard 5 or 6 stories, you can basically finish a woman's story before she's halfway through telling it. And it's so predictable. People say it's like perpetrators have all been studying from the same handbook. And so this gradually increasing community understanding, which has really been on the rise since Hannah Clark and her 3 kids were murdered by Rowan Baxter in February of 2020. It's making a form of abuse that was largely invisible finally visible, and it's putting language to it to help all of us identify it. And victim survivors will say that when they hear coercive control explained, it's like this light bulb moment, especially for those who really never thought of what they went through as domestic abuse because they weren't or were rarely physically assaulted. So in short, coercive control in heterosexual relationships is an almost strictly gendered kind of abuse, and it's mostly perpetrated by men. There are international studies show small percentages of perpetration from women, and this is particularly the case where women have social power or leverage over their partner, particularly if a male partner is disabled. In same-sex relationships or other relationships, however, men, women, non-binary people perpetrate this type of abuse. It's really a patriarchal dynamic where one person feels entitled to have power over the other and is able to leverage that power. Now, how common is coercive control in family violence? Domestic violence services basically say they don't see anything other than coercive control, because if you need help getting out of a relationship, chances are what you're experiencing is not just violence, but a trap, and coercive control is a process of entrapment. So this is essentially a system of abuse that never switches off, even during the good times, and the good times are as much a part of it as the bad times. So it's more than just abuse. It's something the abuser builds gradually over time. And the following behaviours I'll list here, they develop 3 basic conditions in the intimate partner and in families, the children, which is dependency, debility, and dread. So coercive controllers will subordinate and entrap their victims basically by isolating them from sources of support, so friends, family, colleagues, micromanaging their behaviour, how they cook, how they clean, how they dress, exploiting their resources, which could be their money, it could be their labour, depriving them of their basic needs, constantly accusing partners of infidelity and other betrayals to pressure them to prove their loyalty. And this will be done to the kids too, pressuring them to prove their loyalty. And sometimes that can be by spying on the protective parent and reporting back. Depriving them of sleep, monitoring their time, monitoring them through online communication tools or spyware, intimidating and belittling them, so degrading them to the point where they really don't feel like they could be with anybody else. Enforcing rules for the whole family which humiliate, degrade, or dehumanize. Particularly financial abuse, very common, up to 90% of cases of coercive control, include exploitation, deception, fraud, allowing just a punitive allowance or preventing the partner from working, threats to children and or pets, or actual physical or sexual violence, forcing the victim to take part in criminal activity, criminal damage like destruction of household goods, threats to hurt or kill, threats to rape, threats to reveal or publish private information, gaslighting, and basically creating this environment of total confusion, contradiction, and extreme threat. So this is all done to subordinate and entrap both the partner and the children, who we can understand as co-victims of this process. And most importantly, this is really invasive. So slowly, every area of private space a victim survivor has to feel like a free person is taken over by the perpetrator. And I think in this context, that's why financial abuse is so almost ubiquitous in coercive control in a way that physical violence is not. And so I think it was the Boscar study that looked at the fact that 42% of people who experience coercive control say they did not experience physical or sexual violence. So it's a large minority. So these coercive control behaviours are not just used against the victim parent, but against the kids as well. And children are secondary victims of coercive control, not because they suffer less harm, but because the coercive controller will often harm them as an extension of their subordination of the protective parent. Now, one 13-year-old I interviewed told me that he felt so desperately alone, despite having close friends at school, because he knew the rule was he could never tell anyone what was going on at home. And his father was a police officer, so that threat was even greater. And this guy would literally put his gun on the dinner table at dinner time. And the threat that lived in that household was so extreme. The sorts of things he would do to his kids, like his daughter, who loved him, who he used to call his little trailer because she was constantly trailing behind him, trying to show him how much she loved him. He would say to her that she was not allowed to get up and use the toilet in the middle of the night. And then he would also get her in trouble if she wet the bed. So these are the sorts of traps that are set for kids. And this is why you see in children the same resultant harms as that experienced by intimate partners, in the sense that over time, and Dr. Emma Katz in the UK has shown this, over time, they see the same kind of harm stemming from living with coercive control as they see from experiencing direct physical or sexual abuse. And the experience of living in coercive control is that the world of the child is shrunk. They have fewer outside sources of support. And most of you on this call will know that is what children need to be resilient in the face of danger and risk at home. And what we know for sure is that kids just don't passively accept the presence of danger and threat. They will actively adapt to it. So they do whatever they can to manifest and maximize their own safety. And I think the Harvard psychiatrist Judith Herman writes really well about this when she says these children have to find a way to preserve a sense of trust in people who are untrustworthy, safety in a situation that is unsafe, control in a situation that is terrifyingly unpredictable, and power in a situation of helplessness. And sometimes the way the child protects themselves is to become the one who is using violence in the home. Sometimes that is actually to distract the abusive parent from directing violence against the protective parent. Other times it feels like the only way to assert power in this powerless situation is to become the scary one. And one child articulated this so well to the ACT Children and Young People Commissioner when they said, when you're hurt and when you're faced with violence, it feels like you only have two options. You either are the one who is violent or you're the one that gets hurt. And then that leaves you to have a really bad view of the world where you're like, if I don't hurt others, then they'll hurt me. And I don't want to be hurt because being hurt was so awful. I just want to protect myself. And I think, we sometimes lose sight of the intergenerational cycle of violence. And the Crime Statistics Agency report found 3 out of 4 kids who are exposed to family violence had a future of interaction with the justice system within 5 years as either victims or perpetrators. So this, I think, is the pointy end that we need to be devoting more resources to, especially to recovery and to keeping protective parents together with their children. Now, if Rani allows me just a couple of minutes, I'd just like to finish up talking about family court, because I think it's really important. We can do a lot of work in helping to protect children, but we can't always be there to stop that original betrayal from their parents, from their step-parents, from taking place. But we can do a lot to prevent the institutions that are supposed to protect them from betraying them as well. So really, when you're looking at 2 phases of this betrayal that kids go through, one is the original trauma, and the second is the way in which they're responded to. And really, when we look at the family court now, and thanks to the Lighthouse Project, we know now that over 80% of family law cases involve allegations of family violence. And that's much higher than what was previously believed. There was an Australian Institute of Studies report in 2015 that found only 38% of family law matters had 4 or more risk factors, and that there was a much lower rate of family violence picked up in that report. Now we know that 64% of litigants are initially screening in this high risk category, having 4 or more risk factors. And sector advocates have been insisting that the numbers are really high for years, higher than the court would confirm. And now we actually have the statistics to prove it. So essentially, the family law courts have become family violence courts by default. And I like to put it this way, to just put it into context. We're not talking just about parental access. We're talking about court orders. And, we think about previous centuries where judges could order an abused woman to return to her husband as something that was cruel and unjust, and something that we fortunately have moved past now. And the idea that a court would make that kind of order seems unthinkable. But that's basically what the family law system still does to some kids. And even in cases where kids openly disclose abuse, say unequivocally they are terrified, they do not want to see their abusive parent, and even have that testimony corroborated by police, social workers, teachers, doctors. You know, sometimes those children will not have been actually physically or sexually abused themselves, but they will have lived with, resisted, and been subjected to coercive control. And the threat that they face being ordered to see that parent is so great. There is no review process once that order has been made. If they try to run away, and many kids I've spoken to have tried, they can actually be pursued by federal police and returned to their custodial parent. And I think that, I mean, it's great to see this proposed reform to the Family Law Act to end the presumption of shared parental responsibility, but there is a culture of pro-contact in the family courts which is alarming. And I think just to close, something that I think we really need to pay much more attention to is the level of unsubstantiated reports of child sex abuse in the family court. And that was revealed recently by a research team from Lawrence Maloney led that team from La Trobe University. And what it found was that between 2012 and 2019, only 14% of child sex abuse allegations that were heard in the family law courts were substantiated. So 86% were found to be unsubstantiated. And anybody who works in this area will know that does not marry with the evidence. What we see around, probably in studies, we've seen about a rate of 10 to 12% of false or just, what ended up being false allegations of child sex abuse in family law court context. But there is no study on planet Earth that has found that 86% of child sex abuse allegations are unfounded. So we have situations now where children are being ordered into the care of a parent who is almost certainly sexually abusing them among that cohort. And so what information and advice are these family court judges getting in evidence? What is the quality of family court reports? Are child protection failing to assess these cases properly? There are so many questions that are unanswered in this area in terms of family court and the way that we protect children and guarantee them some independence from family violence once they and their protective parent has left.
Wow, Jess, thank you for that. There was so much, and so much of that was quite disturbing, to be honest. And we should be disturbed so that we can actually take some action. And we need to really look behind the scenes of a lot of what you just exposed about what's happening in the family law courts, these institutions that we implicitly trust, and how do we shift that culture? What does that look like? And I'm hoping that Moo and Biljana will have some ideas to share on that as well. I just want to remind our audience that we are a podcast today. Sorry about the lack of video to everyone. We've just had some tech difficulties with GoToWebinar, and we are now a audio only recording, but we hope you stay with us and join the conversation. I encourage you to send questions through throughout the session, so please do pop in any questions you have for Jess and we'll get to them towards the end. And now I'd like to invite Moo to join us and share her thoughts, some reflections perhaps on what Jess was saying, but more so to kind of give her perspective on the work she's been doing. Moo is the Director of Primary Prevention at WayCheck, and she is the Chair of the Our Watch Board. Moo is a social justice and gender equity leader with more than 20 years experience in non-government and the for-purpose private sector. She's had a career-long commitment to addressing and preventing violence and promoting human rights in Australia, UK, Spain and Southeast Asia. So some really different perspectives there that Moo brings, and she's passionate about the intersections between gender equality and racial justice. And she's been a fantastic advocate in this space for many years, and we're really glad to have you, Moo. So over to you.
Thank you, Rani. And I too am joining you from Gadigal land this morning, paying my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledging that sovereignty has never been ceded and that this was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. particularly at this important time when we're having big conversations as a nation about how we want to be better for the next generation, and particularly for young people and children as well. Thanks for having me today. Jess, I'm just a bit gobsmacked after that. I mean, you and I have been working together for a long time in this space, and it's nice for me to be able to just say to you, thank you for all of the work that you do. You are leading such an important part of the conversation, and you know, I think back to some of those conversations we had back in the day, probably almost 10 years ago now, where we were talking about family court, and you know, some of those parents, some of those protective mums that we both spoke to and have in common. And I think an immense amount has changed, partly because of your advocacy in this space. So please keep on talking. It's so important that Australia starts to understand the scale of this problem and the impacts of it everywhere, right? It is, it's a great honour to be a part of this, and thank you also for allowing me to come along to the launch yesterday. National Child Protection Week is an opportunity, I think, for all of us to just stop and reflect and think about children in a way that we should be doing all year round. Somebody reflected yesterday at the launch that we have a whole load of plans and lots of programmatic funding, but it's a piece of connecting it all up that seems to be missing. And I think for anybody who's worked in this space for a while, that view of where the gaps are makes a lot of sense. For me, you know, reading the Australian Child Maltreatment Survey was not only deeply disturbing, but it also just resonated as well, I think, for anybody that's been working either in the domestic violence space, the family violence space, or working with children and young people in this space as well. And we've talked forever within the women's services space about, you know, working with children as victims in their own right, but we never really seem to have nailed that particularly well. And Jess is right. You know, there are more children and young people in refuges than there are women. Unfortunately, there's very little funding government-wise in that space, and certainly in New South Wales, we've seen over the last decade or so child specialist workers that used to be in almost every refuge in New South Wales are less likely to be there, although there has been you know, a bit of funding over the last few years to start to reinstate those important positions, because if children are coming into refuges, we know that when a child walks through that door, if we get the right supports in place, we can start undoing some of that real damage. We know that children who experience those adverse child experiences are, you know, not just witnesses, and we talked for a long time about children as being witnesses to violence. I like that you use the framing co-victims, Jess, because I think we really need to shift the way that we think about children and young people who have grown up in a household where there's significant violence, and whether that's physical violence or whether it's coercive control, that living in fear, that you know, that feeling of walking on eggshells deeply affects people. And I've got, you know, this is personal to me. I've got many people who are quite close to me who are living as adults with the impact of neglect and abuse and maltreatment in childhood. And the effects are visceral, and they are everywhere. They are everywhere in our society. If you're out there having conversations with people in any public or community space about domestic or family violence, you know, you can spot in a room, and Jess, I'm sure you've had this experience too, where you know, you look up in a room and you can see those adults, you know who those people are who've grown up in this environment. And so we know the Australian Child Maltreatment Survey tells us just how widespread that is. And also, I think, really challenges us to consider what our role is in terms of creating a different future for the next generation. We have a million reports. We have a, you know, a ton of different national plans, which don't necessarily link up with one another. We have, you know, a pretty strong evidence base now about what the scale of the problem is. And for anybody working in this space, whether you're working with children or young people, whether you're working in with families, whether you're working, you know, with victim survivors, it's so important that we are looking at this in a holistic sense, and that all the parts of the support system, as well as things like, you know, businesses, employers and others, are really doing their own pieces to be able to respond well, and are sending out a really clear message that actually this is not the future that we want for children and young people, and that people will be believed when they choose to disclose, and that they will be supported in a way that addresses that cumulative harm. And often that cumulative harm we see in a women's refuge setting really manifests through the mother-child attachment relationship. So the more that we can get that work being done in the front line and getting really skilled workers into those frontline crisis services, the better, because we owe children and young people you know, a good response and an evidence-based response, and something that is going to help them to start to repair and heal through therapeutic interventions and support. One of the things that we do at WAGEC, at Women's and Girls Emergency Centre, and I guess we're a medium-sized women's service, women and children's service, based in inner city Sydney and the inner west of Sydney. We have 2 families refuges. We have a single women's refuge, and we have transitional housing, which is that housing piece, you know, after people are out of that crisis, helping people get back on their feet again. And one of the things that we do have at WAGEC, which is quite unusual, and a chunk of this is done through, you know, philanthropic funding. We go out there and we fundraise, is to have a program for children and young people with child specialist workers, and really working with them to start to address some of those adverse childhood experiences. And we know if you do that intensive work, you know, as early on as possible, and provides tailored supports through multidisciplinary approaches, ideally, then you can really make a difference to children who are co-victims, who are, you know, accompanying mum into a refuge setting, and ideally getting them into their own safe home as quickly as possible after that. The other thing that we do is we do a whole ton of primary prevention work, and so primary prevention, when we think about what that looks like in a women's services setting, primary prevention is really all about addressing the underlying drivers, particularly of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and looking at what we can do as a society, as a community, to start addressing the underlying drivers and the factors that allow violence against women to occur in Australia. And we know the size of the problem, we know the impacts, we know the ripple effects that go across not just families, but extended families and communities. So something I wanted to share with you today is a relatively new program that we've just been running since last year. In New South Wales, we are going out to 12 early childhood education centres across New South Wales, and this is really based on some excellent work that's been done in Victoria in the primary prevention space. Victoria leads the way because of you know, decades of work in the primary prevention space in Victoria, often between local governments and women's health services. And what we do is we're going out and we're working with early childhood educators to talk to them about what the drivers of violence are, and help them to identify what gender stereotypes are, how they impact on children. And we know the evidence is really clear. We know that gender stereotypes start impacting negatively on children, you know, in that birth to 2 first couple of years of a child's life, and they start to get really deeply reinforced in the 3 to 5, in the age 3 to 5, before children are even getting into schools. So children are forming really quite deeply embedded thoughts about gender and how they should express that gender very, very early on. And the aim of this project is to just work with educators, with centre directors, and with families as well, to say gender stereotypes harm everybody. And if we can start to address that at an early age, if we can start to encourage children to meet their full potential from the earliest age, rather than saying, you know, I'm a girl, so therefore I can't play football, or I'm not going to be good at maths, or I can't be strong, then we will shift some of those perspectives that really deeply embed the gender differences that we accept in Australian society about men and women, and the roles of men and women in society too. So it's pretty early days. We've been out to I think we've been out to about 5 centres now. We are learning an immense amount from every centre that we go to. Educators are really responsive to this, primarily because they are living with the impacts of gender inequality very much in their day-to-day life. You only have to look at the rates of pay that early childhood educators have to see gender inequality deeply embedded within a sector. So having these conversations in what is a slightly different place is a way of just starting to build a stronger understanding across our communities about the value of early childhood education, the value of children being given that, you know, that range of possibilities to be able to grow and to thrive, whatever their experiences have been. And so we know, certainly when we look back at the statistics in the Australian Child Maltreatment Survey, that a significant proportion of those children are going to be growing up in households, and they're going to be going home at the end of the day of playing, learning, being nurtured in an early childhood education environment, and then going home to an environment where there is coercive control, where there are threats, where there is fear. And so the more that we can tackle this from all of the different angles and really start to build people's capacity across different industries and sectors, the more that we can keep children and young people really at the centre of our approaches. So whether it's at that crisis end, you know, the frontline work that we do at WageEc day to day, when things have got really tough for women and children, or whether it's at the prevention end, where we're saying, actually, as a society, this is not what we want for the next generation, and all of the important early intervention pieces in between that sit in a range of different settings, whether it's you know, family centres like Biljana's, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of the work that Biljana and her team do, whether it's supported play groups, whether it's thinking about other parts of the education system where we know, you know, children are more likely to disclose or are more likely to seek support. There's a range of different places that we can all get better at tackling this. I might pause there because I want to hear a bit from Biljana.
Thanks so much, Moo. No, there's lots to unpack in what you've just been saying. I've got lots of different questions bubbling in my head, but I also want to hear from Biljana first, and then we can get into that discussion. Thanks to all of those who've been sending questions through. I know a lot of you are interested in the statistics and the plans, etc., that have been mentioned by Jess, myself, and Moo, and I'm sure Biljana will mention a few as well. We will be sending links out with an email and a recording of this session, so you will get all of those links and be able to access those reports. So now I'm really excited to invite Biljana into this conversation, because we really do want to hear about working directly with children as well in this space, and what are children telling us they need. Biljana Milosevic is a bicultural social worker and the director of Jannawi Family Centre in Sydney. Jannawi is a Darug word for meaning with me, with you. The unique family safety service works with people living with family violence and abuse, including sexual harm. It offers therapeutic interventions to adults, but also importantly to children, and does parent education, risk assessment, child development initiatives. And Biljana has had over 22 years of experience promoting and advocating for family safety. And we're so grateful to have you here today, Biljana, to share the great work that you're doing and what you're seeing on the ground with families.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a little bit of a hard act to follow after Jess and Moo. Huge respect to both of them for the work that they've been doing. I want to acknowledge that we're also on the land of the Gadigal and pay my respects to Aboriginal people and children and families who've been suffering from colonial violence, as well as violence that's sort of seeped down into communities, and to honour the learnings that they've kind of given us in our service. And as you know, I also want to acknowledge the Darug, because that's where our name comes from. So we're really proud of acknowledging Aboriginal history here at Jannawi. And so I guess, a lot of that stuff, I mean, there's a million points, my mind's racing based on what everyone's been talking about, but I just wanted to sort of talk about that concept of and ask people to reflect on why perhaps children are invisible in their services. And what's created that invisibility. I think the issue of family violence is also quite a big one, that I think that the Western construct is to break it down into a whole bunch of different silos and different sections to make it more palatable. But in creating those silos, we've actually created a very complex and convoluted service system for the children and families that we're working with. And perhaps working with kids then makes it a little bit too hard. So we'll sort of keep them to the side and sort of have a little bit of a conversation about what might be happening for them. Our model is very much places children at the centre of all of that. It's a very ecological model that wraps family and community and society around those children. And so we're unable to work with one piece without the other piece. So it's a very integrated model in that way. And if we're not working with children, we miss a huge piece of what might be happening in that family home. And it provides a huge amount of opportunity for change and for recovery and for healing and for shifting things when we actually include the voices of children. And children speak in different ways. You can work with children who are 9 months old and not crawling and sitting in a pram terrified to move. We've worked with kids that will hold back tears and not cry because they don't want to bring any attention to themselves. They want to be invisible in that space. And then, of course, we've got the kids that really let us know that things are not okay by acting out behaviours, which we as a society have started to medicalise. So I just think that children have a really powerful and profound way of showing us that things are not okay. And I think we just need to start paying a little bit better attention to that. Unfortunately, we're medicating, giving them behaviour plans and doing a whole range of other things that are probably not as helpful to children, rather than looking at what's actually the cause and what's behind this and what are these kids trying to let us know. So the idea that children are separate to their parent is important. I feel like this is a little bit of a contradiction in that we will talk about children being co-victims in terms of aligning with mum and seeing the violence, but they're actually victims in their own right. And so in some ways they are separate to their parents because they have their own experiences that are very unique around that violence. And when you're working with families that have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 children, every single one of those children are going to have a very different experience of their father or the person that's using violence. It might be a stepfather or a step parent or carer. And those experiences are very unique. And without tapping into those unique experiences of that harm, there's going to be an assumption and a grouping together of all the kids feel the same, all the kids think the same, all the kids are on the same page with this. And that's kind of really dangerous, because for many of the kids, there's a lot of silence and secrecy around what's happening at home, that even if you know your siblings were there, you don't think that they saw the same things. I've talked to many families where kids will talk about an experience of violence where they believe it was them and their father in the room using the harm, and then you speak to the next sibling and they were there too, and the next sibling was there too. So children are egocentric in their development, and they are very worried about what's going on, and lots of children create their own ways of managing that. Are they the protector? Are they the appeaser? Are they the negotiator in the family? You know, what is the role that they fulfill in all of that, in that space, which we could actually use for their healing, but we miss out because we don't connect and sit and talk with them around that. And then it's even just, how do we safety plan? How do we do case management with children? How do we make sure that their physiological, you know, psychological, but also physical needs are met? How do we get them pediatric appointments? So we know the cause, we know the way that violence harms children, and yet the case management and support of those children is fairly lacking in our service system, about connecting with schools, about safety planning, about talking to children about their AVOs and letting them know what an AVO is, and using really plain children's language to explain what the conditions are and what it all involves. Because part of the safety is that kids will be part of that loop, and they can have a really important role to play in keeping themselves, their mum and their family safe, and actually holding dads to account. Kids are really good at doing that in ways that, you know, we talk about accountability, and we talk about the criminal justice system, and we talk about how important police responses are. But in our work, we just think that the most important responses are ones that kids give to the people that use the harm, and how they can keep them accountable in that practice once they're supported and given information and advice in all of that. So the other thing I just wanted to challenge is, we don't see children as co-victims, and we don't see them as witnesses to violence. We see them as direct victims of harm and direct victims of coercive control. They might witness coercive control towards their mother, and that is a form of harm. But we also sort of want to invite people to think about the way coercion, which Jess has already mentioned before, you know, asking children to assault their mum or assault their siblings or be the man of the house or instill rules, is a form of direct harm to that child. To rip up a child's homework and then turn up to a school meeting and talk about how this child doesn't do their homework is just a form of, you know, brainwashing and confusion that children directly experience. To not be able to go to the toilet when you need, to not be able to have shoes that dad refuses to buy you because it's in spite of mum. These are direct harms to children. This is a child abuse issue. And because we're calling it family violence, and then we call it child abuse, and then we call it neglect, that siloing and that separation means that we don't have to then really come to terms with the fact that we're causing direct harm to children in these households. And then how do we then not have a conversation with dad about the direct harm that he's causing to the children when he thinks he's leaving them out of the loop and leaving them out of the picture and they haven't seen anything? So it's how do we start seeing children as direct recipients of coercive control, which then also leads into another tactic which is quite powerful, which I really want to talk about, is that attacking that mother-child relationship, really attacking the way that women can support their children and care for their children is a direct form of harm to children, in that that parent that may be protective of them is prevented from being protective of them. And then these are the women, of course, that have their children removed, and our child protection systems come in with a fail to protect lens, which keeps the perpetrator invisible to what the harm that he's caused, but it also creates a wedge, again, that we're doing the work on behalf of the perpetrator. So where threats are made about you will lose your kids, I'll talk to child protection about that. These threats are real, not because they're in his head, but because we as a system support him in making those threats and then following through with the consequences that he has threatened. So it's a call to all of us that work in child protection about how do we support women to support children. But when we support children directly, we hear directly from them the things that are said, the things that happen in the home, their experiences of that, and we have a lot of richer information, which is really powerful when it comes to family courts, case notes, documentation, conversations with parents, conversations with men who use violence. These are all deeper and more meaningful conversations because we hear directly from the people, the little ones that are impacted by that. And so this also then lets me just have a quick talk about culturally, linguistically and religiously diverse families. I think we need to add an R to the acronym, but there is a lot of faith-based and spiritual and cultural abuse that the kids that we work with here in Southwest Sydney experience, which is just another layer of the violence in society. It's around racism and discrimination they sort of see their parents living with. And I know this resonates with First Nations families too, that police harassment and police violence also matches or looks just as similar to the stuff that might be happening at home. And so how do we approach these families with an understanding of the layers that they're also managing around keeping that family together, particularly for refugee and migrant communities? And that we sort of use an approach which is talking about the culture of violence, which is that the violence is what's causing the harm. It's not the cultural understandings or the cultural belief systems in a way, which they do support that. But there are people from those cultures and communities that don't use violence and don't have violence in their homes. And so we look at that difference and look at, well, what's unique in this family, and what you usually find is intergenerational violence and trauma that seep through that community and then into that family. And so when we dissect violence from the cultural understandings and background, then we allow children to step back into being connected to culture and religion and community that is then safe and protective for them. But it's a really powerful way of silencing and keeping women and children separate to community by using religion and culture as an excuse for him doing what he wants to be doing. And so that's also a form of direct harm. Like that cultural abuse is a really powerful way of keeping children and women in their place. And it's really kind of something that we need to be a little bit more nuanced to when we're talking with communities from diverse backgrounds, because the first thing you'll hear is, this is in my community, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, but in your community, we also don't have that as well. So that strengths-based approach of safe and healthy and nurturing relationships and what culture gives and how that violence is taken that away as well. So just to kind of end, I just wanted to do a little bit of, there are such beautiful opportunities when working with children to be able to give key messages that, they're not to blame, that it's not their fault, that the things that hurting is happening from their dad to their mum, and he's responsible for changing that. And it allows kids to make some meaning of what's going on. It has an explanation as to what's happening, so it's a little bit outside of them, because kids are egocentric, so they'll take it on unless we come in and sort of challenge that and give another perspective on that. Sharing information about what's happening is really powerful for kids to hear that, and they have lots of questions sometimes. And even if they don't have questions, then they're listening very intently to what we're having to say. And what's really powerful in our work is that children really want us to be supporting their mum and their dad, not necessarily because they love their dad or care about them, because they want him to stop what he's doing. And then how do we build that mother-child connection unless we have both of an understanding of what's happening for mum and also what's happening for her kids, and explaining to her what's happening for her kids is a really powerful way of building a bridge. And just on a final note, the other thing I just want to put out there to challenge us, which is another big idea, is that we say that kids love their parents, and necessarily, you know, on the whole, that's a very strong societal message, but sometimes kids don't love their parents. Kids don't love the people that hurt them and hurt their mums and hurt their siblings. And they have a lot of anger and hatred towards the person that uses violence. And that is a perfectly understandable and respectable position to have. And yet we as a society somehow think that's something wrong when they think that way. We very much have a strong belief here at Jannawi that love and violence do not go together. We very much take the view of Carl Jung. So I'm going to, use a 100-year-old quote to finish here to say that where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. So where you have violence and where you have power and where you're predominating over another, it extinguishes the love that is there. And so this is what we use to challenge men who talk about loving their kids and their partners. But we also give kids the space to not love the people that hurt them as well. That's it from me.
Thank you, Biljana. That was a really powerful note to end on, and I really appreciated your advice on, working directly with kids, what you need to do and how you might help them make some sense of what's happening around them, because that egocentric perspective that kids have and that meaning making is so important when we know that a lot of the research shows if you've experienced violence in childhood, you're more likely to go on to either be a victim or a perpetrator of violence. So that opportunity to help kids make sense of what's happening and get the healing and support they need is critical. I think one thread that's gone across all three of you that I really want to pick up on and is really central to this whole discussion and prevention of abuse and neglect broadly is the voice of the child. So, Biljana, you spoke really well about, what you and your service do in bringing that to the fore and really, making sure that children are heard in their own right. And I love that point, the clear point that you made, about children all experiencing it differently, even if they're in a sibling group and have witnessed the same behaviour. So, it's not just this one linear kind of experience. And Jess, in the beginning, you also mentioned that children will speak out about their experiences of abuse, and sometimes it'll even be, quite widely corroborated, and still there'll be court orders made, that don't really marry up with what they're saying and what their wishes are. So I would like to kind of just hear from each of you, I suppose, around what you think we could be doing better in really valuing children's voices, and what's the block there? Like, if children are already speaking up and saying, how do we get the sector more broadly and the workforce skilled up in this? But I guess it's also a bit of a shift in culture, isn't it, around decision makers really valuing children's voices. So just wanted to see if you've seen areas where this is done really well, or if you've got some ideas on how we might collectively take this forward. I'll start with Jess.
Yeah, thanks, Ronnie, and thanks so much, Biljana. 100% agree with everything you've just said. And I think that especially that point about how children make meaning of what they've experienced, and that you've got the golden child, you've got, to use a, bit of an archetype, and then you've got other kids who become ally to their abusers. I mean, it's just so broad, and even within two siblings, you can have multiple roles being played out at once in one kid. Now, I think I can just speak to, I guess, what I see in my direct cohort, which is media, and that is a real reluctance to want to speak directly to kids, even with consent of a protective parent, because they fear that they will re-traumatize them, or that they don't know how to talk to kids about this. And so they kind of journalists just basically back away from that truck, essentially. And what that ends up with is more adults speaking on behalf of kids in stories about kids. Now, I really wanted to disrupt that when I was writing the book, See What You Made Me Do, And particularly in book form, where you're not having to have a kid on television identifying themselves, which is a whole nother issue and something to be taken really seriously. But I interviewed I was something like 10 or 12 kids between the age of 8 and 18 with consent from whoever their protective guardian was. For the younger kids. And honestly, it's some of the most stark and incredible material in the book. And I learned so much talking to these kids about coercive control, particularly from the perspective from some of them as being quite outside of the influence side of the coercive control. And what I mean by that is, for example, that 13-year-old who had the Victorian police officer as the offender in his home. That was his stepfather, and for him, I mean, he just hated him outright, and he wasn't trying to get that man's affection. He didn't understand why his sister, for whom that was her biological father, and he was really like the voice of reason for his mother. And so there was so much I learned from them in terms of the individual roles of kids in these situations, and the fact that so often it's actually kids who are initiating the plan to leave, who may even be managing it for the protective parent, because the coercive control has been so degrading and debilitating. So I would like to see, I know we have to be very careful in the media, and certainly there are some journalists I would never want to speak to kids who've gone through trauma, to be honest. But I do think that there needs to be more access for journalists to education and guidance on how to speak to kids, and alongside that, if it's possible, I'd love to see a future where if there was trust built with a journalist, there was possibly, and I don't mean to say this in any disparaging way to sector, I totally understand the reason for gatekeeping, but perhaps less of I think there's kids who are 14 and over who really feel like they kind of get prevented from speaking. And I think more and more these kids are becoming very mature at very early ages, and kind of are perfectly capable of speaking for themselves and assessing whether they want to speak publicly about that. So with proper consents, with proper education, with proper guidance, I'd really like to see kids more frequently being able to represent themselves in ways that don't jeopardise their futures.
Thanks, Jess. Moo, did you have anything you wanted to add to what Jess is saying there?
Yeah, I think we have not done a great job at valuing the voices of lived expertise of adults, let alone kids. And I think it's one of those real challenges that we all grapple with, but also I suspect we will get better at. It's really only with the new National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children that was launched late last year that we started to see a whole strand of that plan recognising and valuing lived expertise as a really critical piece in terms of developing policy, developing programs, working in a whole range of spaces. There's the new, I think they're called the Independent Collective of Survivors, that's been set up by Lula Dembele, and we're really starting in the domestic violence and the intimate partner violence against women space to start to understand the value of ensuring that voices of lived expertise are there consistently all the time. It's not just something we tack on at the end, or we don't just hear somebody's horrific story at the beginning of a conference that shocks everybody to their core, and then and they spill their guts out and then leave. So we're getting there. And I think the mental health advocacy space has done a really good job at this over the years of really training and supporting people who do want to share their experiences, to be able to do it in a way that is, ethical and safe, and people can withdraw consent, all of those sorts of considerations that Jess was talking about. I also think about the documentary, like I'm thinking about how much things have changed, and I think back to the Hitting Home documentary that Jess was a part of, Sarah Ferguson's documentary back in, it would have been about 2015, I think, which was the first time that women's refuges and women's services were shown on Australian screens. And it was a 2-part documentary where Sarah and her team took cameras into, those frontline crisis responses, and how carefully I think the production team worked to ensure that, children's voices and experiences and confidentiality was protected through those things. So I think there are models for this collaboration between, journalists and frontline services, and those people who are directly impacted there in that moment, to be able to do this better. So I do have a sense of hope. I guess I always question what the purpose is. So it's, of course, it's really important that we are hearing from children and young people about their experiences. And Biljana, you're spot on. Like, every single child is going to have a different way of talking about what they've experienced, and will have different needs. And where I think that purpose about incorporating children's voices into, better programs, getting feedback on what they've actually, the support that they've received from a service, for example. If we are enhancing their healing and recovery, then I think we should look at every way that we possibly can to do that. But I do have some kind of fears around, and I have these fears just from the experiences of watching victim survivors, advocate really, really strongly for their voices to be incorporated into, policy development, that if it's not done well enough, then it can be a disappointing experience. So we've just got to make sure that we're putting that person, whether it's a little person or whether it's a big person, at the centre of our rationale for doing that.
That's a really good point, Moo. I think it's really significant that we have accountability around why we are involving victim survivors, and especially if they're children and young people, and providing those supports along the way and managing some of those expectations, because at some point it becomes outside of the control of, whoever is providing that sort of link between, it'll be the media or it'll be the politicians or the decision makers who will take it one way or the other. But how do we make sure that the voices are heard in an authentic way, and it's not just, adding a nice little quote at the beginning of a report or something for someone? So how do we hold ourselves to that? But Moo, I just wanted to ask really quickly for your reflections on the intersectional sort of need, to represent voice of children. Often I, think that we end up speaking to one type of experience. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I do. I've got lots of thoughts on.
I bet you do.
It's probably another whole podcast episode on its own, and I'm probably not the best person to speak on it either. I'm sure there are people that are much better qualified. But I think again, intersectionality can be a bit of a kind of buzzword, or a way of slotting our thinking. And I think actually, when I reflect back on all of the people that I've spoken to over the years, who have had, they may have had experiences of child sexual assault, sexual abuse in a family setting as a young child. They've then gone on to have, a series of different experiences of, abuse in relationships, in intimate partnerships. Potentially also they're coming up against some of that really structural and systemic violence and exclusion, particularly when we're talking about people who are transgender or gender diverse, or gender binary, gender non-binary, sorry. We know that people don't just come with one nice, neat experience, and so we shouldn't be looking at it through the lens of, this child has a disability, and so we need to meet those needs there, and then we shuffle them off to another service to start working on the healing and recovery piece here. And unfortunately, that's the way that the system is still structured. I love hearing Biljana talk about the work that they do at Jannawi, because it really is you know, that child walks through the door and it is a whole of service model. You know, that child is really being put genuinely at the center, but unfortunately that's not the way the system is set up, and I think that's what needs to happen. We need to flip the way that we are responding to people, particularly children and young people, because they have such a diversity of needs and experiences that are not going to fit nice and neatly into, you know, a national plan for violence against women, and start to think about how we can absolutely wrap around every single piece around that child. And often that will be, like, I think about the prevention space and some of the stuff you were saying there, Biljana, and I'm going off topic a little bit, but I'm thinking about how we elevate some of those voices within multicultural and multi-faith communities that are really doing this work and have been doing this work for a long time. And when you think about that in the prevention space, you know, there are faith leaders, there are community leaders, there are scholars, there are people who are deeply respected within their communities, who are the ones that we want to be having the loudest voices in this space, because they will be the ones who actually shift that ecosystem for children and young people. You know, just as there are perpetrators of violence in families and in intimate partners who use religion and faith as an excuse or culture, so there are many more who are willing to speak out and say this is not a part of who we are, whether that's in a First Nations community setting or any other. I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, you have. I guess I wanted to just bring in, that there's so many different perspectives, and that we've got to be conscious of not trying to do the one size fits all in a plan or in a framework. It's not going to be, it always will need to be tailored onto the ground. And Biljana, you spoke really well about what your service does and how you respond to individual kids and their needs. Did you want to share a little bit with us? Is your service quite unique, Biljana, or are there many others like yours that you know of across Australia? Love to hear a bit more about, you know, the work that you're doing in really kind of showcasing the voice of children.
Yeah, no, we're very unique. A lot of people ring us and go, what's the service in our area like yours? And we're like, there really isn't one. And that's because we developed from the grassroots, like from the ground up. We started off as a therapeutic preschool back in the day as the Wiley Park Centre. And it was to work with the huge rates of child abuse in the Canterbury local area, which we had about 80 children reported to welfare in 1976, I think it was, and there was outrage about that number. And as we offered a therapeutic preschool to a lot of the 4-year-olds in the area where welfare had referred them, that was the term back in the day, we then started to understand why they weren't making it to the therapeutic preschool every day. So we attached a bus, and then we talked to mum, and then mum would talk about the violence that she experienced the night before. And so it sort of organically grew from what does the family need and what does this child need from us. We had paediatric support. We used to come in and so a lot of our case management was focused on the child and then the family and community and then groups. And so it kind of organically grew from there. And what makes us unique as well is that we talk to fathers who use violence in the home, and we talk to them about the impact that their behaviour has on their partners and their kids and how to make that safe. And we do that because Women and Children 30 years ago said, why aren't you talking to him about what he's doing? And we're like, yeah, fair point. And so I think coming back to how the systems are set up is that the systems were set up in certain ways, but then we miss that opportunity to blend because it's come back to being terrified about speaking to kids, not wanting to cause more harm, but inadvertently we might cause more harm in that way. And there's a lot of still a lot of worldviews around children and around women and around fathers and their rights, and we can't prevent children from seeing their dads, and all these messages that keep, as much as we do training and support and webinars, there's still these deep-seated belief systems in society that prevent and sort of keep us really rooted to this family model and keeping the family together and not not wanting to rock the boat. I mean, there's a whole range of them. You know, you can think of millions of them, but so a lot of our work is about unpacking a lot of those messages about, well, yeah, children have a right to safety. And if that father is not safe, well, then that supersedes that. How is that person fulfilling that fathering role? Is even doing anything in that fathering role, or is it just a showpiece? So there's a lot of societal messages that that get in the way of how we do the work, and then obviously the systems responses around that. But if we truly listen to that, it's really powerful what we can change. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Biljana, because that really leads to a few of the questions that we're getting from the audience that's listening to us today. And it's really about that cultural change. How do we bring others along in this wider conversation and then, build that into the institutional responses? Like what we were hearing from Jess in the beginning around the family court and that reluctance to really hear the voice of children and to kind of err towards, making sure that there's enough contact, and how to kind of build that deeper understanding across schools and preschools and doctors, so that they all ask child-centered questions and also ask about what else is happening in the home. There's studies that show that children who are disengaged, I think Biljana, you were mentioning this, at school are often diagnosed or referred on to get some kind of, ADHD or something medical, whereas really it's things that are happening in the home that are making it really hard for the child to settle and really learn. So I guess I want some reflections from you all around that culture change piece. Like, how do we bring that change to happen? How do we have these wider conversations when there are so many deeply embedded norms around family and around gendered, interactions in particular, if you're looking at that sort of kind of heteronormative sort of setup. Moo, there's a question in particular around that program that you mentioned that really, I guess goes to the heart of some of this, which is about if we're equipping these little kids to have conversations about gender, and it is really important that we have inclusive conversations, and we are breaking down those girls' toys, boys' toys kind of mentality. But if the parents aren't along on that journey, and cultural diversity comes into this as well, Biljana, how are we setting those kids up for a bit of a disconnect when they get home and they're having these conversations, the grown-ups in their life, but the modeling's different? How do we try to integrate these sorts of approaches? Biljana, maybe I'll go with you first.
Well, yeah, you can't really do one without the other, I suppose. You've got to, and I think, look, every next generation is there to challenge the generation before it. So a little bit of tension is never a bad thing in our eyes. Kids can sometimes educate parents around that stuff. But I think that particularly in diverse communities, you really have to take families along with you, and particularly parents, about these are the belief systems that underpin what the harm that's been happening in the family. And then when you really unpack that, there's a real freedom in thinking about, those messages and those core roots that haven't really worked for those individuals, and that you're not really throwing out culture when you're throwing out those outdated ideas. But, we joke here too. It's like, well, you didn't have a mobile phone in the village, but you adapted and got a mobile phone, didn't you? So, you can move with the times in one bit and then not in another bit. And we challenge that perspective all the time about things have to move and change. And this is how it will help your kids and you to have a different way of seeing the world.
I really like that, and I like the fact that you also mentioned in your talk that it's not about throwing out culture, because I think a lot of the times diverse communities and families don't want to engage with services because they're a bit worried that you're going to come in with all these other norms and just try to supplant what they're already doing, and they're like, no, but we like our culture. And it's like, no, we're actually challenging that culture of violence, and things like respect for elders and things like that can be maintained, but as long as there is mutual respect as well. So how do you keep the bits of culture that are really powerful and really strong. And you hear this a lot in First Nations communities as well, where, you know, you need to keep some of that cultural norm, but also create space for those, you know, more challenging conversations that might be happening through the modern sort of world and the experiences that young people are having in relationships and things like that. Jess, I wanted to bring you into this because I know you have brought in the conversation about media and how to have a broader conversation about these cultural norms, because unless we start talking about it more openly, I think we're not going to get that political will and that social support for decision makers and these cruddy old institutions to really start shifting their thinking. Did you want to share with us?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, Biljana and Moo have much more sort of direct experience with this. I mean, I think I guess I would like to reflect also the enormous strides that have been made, particularly in diversity and representation on screens. Like, and it's really brought home to me because I have a 6-year-old who is, you know, watching different programs for her. You know, Little Jam Big Cuz on ABC iView is her favourite program about, you know, 2 Indigenous kids growing up with their nan out in Central Australia. That she, you know, I noticed the other day that she had coloured in this, you know, drawing about Alison Lester's Magic Beach, and there's all these bodies on the beach, and she's used all different colours, different skin tone colours, just off her own back. Now, I just compare that to when I was growing up, and I grew up in a like basically Caucasian enclave in the Northern Beaches, which pretty much remains that way to this day. But not only the physical enclave, but on screen, there was just no presence of diversity culturally, of gender diversity, of options for how we could be as girls or as boys. And so I don't have so much to add in terms of how we radically shift something, in the sense that I think we already are radically shifting things, and I know already that Stevie's going to grow up with such a different understanding of what it means to be a girl or a person in the modern world than I did.
That is true. We are seeing so many different stories being shared, and it's about building, I guess, on that momentum of how do we have different conversations, how do we value diversity, but also how do we bring along those that are not accessing the same sort of shows that we might be, or, you know, having the conversations or reading the media, now that we're in this sort of, you know, world where people can choose where they go. So I think that's not a thing we're going to solve today in the next 5 minutes, but it is something that, you know, I think I challenge all of us to think about. How do we have these conversations and discussions so we're breaking out of our little bubbles, but really bringing people along? And, you know, where you start with that conversation can make a big difference to opening up you know, that thinking for people, and not just kind of going, oh no, that's not for me, I'm already turned off this topic, but to say, how do we bring children into that conversation and really centre their experience? We've found that to be a really powerful way, rather than starting with the parents sometimes, particularly when you're talking about interpersonal dynamics or domestic and family violence. So that's something that I just wanted to kind of raise there. The one question that we're getting in lots of different ways is very much about the prevention piece here. So do we think, for example, the National Plan to End Violence Against Women goes far enough, or are there other ways that we really, and I guess Moo, I might get you in on this initially with your work, particularly in primary prevention, how do we actually, make sure that we are shifting this? Because we're still hearing about, you know, horrendous rates of women being killed by their intimate partners, and the experience from the child maltreatment study showed that 2 in 5 young people are still getting, you know, experiencing exposure to domestic violence. It's a really serious issue. How do we make sure we're turning the curve and not seeing this in the next generation or the one after?
Yeah, absolutely. It's big, important, and often really difficult work. I just wanted to reflect back on the question about, you know, how do you address this stuff when educators might be having conversations with children in an early childhood education setting about gender, and then going home and having really different experiences or different conversations in the family setting. This is where that kind of whole of centre model comes in. So we know that we can't influence the way that early childhood educators are having those conversations without having, the conversation as well with families and engaging families, because families are as much a part of the centre and they surround that the community of that centre. We were up delivering the program last night in the Blue Mountains, and one of the educators just reflected, and she said there was a family that was a bit hesitant about, or was asking questions about what conversations they were having with children about gender. And she said, our children talk about gender every single day. It's so deeply embedded through every part of society that it's not something that you can't talk about. All play, all of their activities, there will be gender and identity that comes in there somehow, whether or not they're using those words. So it's really drawing on things like the new early years learning framework is incredible. It talks a lot about equity and inclusion, and recognising that all children have the right to participate in quality and inclusive early childhood settings, regardless of gender, strengths, capabilities, diverse ways of being and doing. The way that we deliver that program is we actually have a couple of Aboriginal facilitators who have deep early childhood expertise, who deliver a whole unit around First Nations traditional ways of nurturing, looking at shared collective parenting models, things that are really deeply embedded in many cultures, actually. In terms of that taking responsibility and that safety for children. So there are things that we can draw on that already exist, and it's all about that strengths-based, looking for the things that already exist and really elevating them and connecting them to people's experiences wherever they come from.
Yes.
Thanks, Moo. And the primary prevention bit, how are we gonna fix everything, Moo?
Well, we're going to fix everything. It's a good question, and I know we're already over time. Look,
yeah.
I think there is real potential for the children and young people framework, whatever that looks like, to connect up with Change the Story and some of the work that's been done in the primary prevention of violence against women sector. We know some of those drivers will be really different. We know some of the approaches will be really similar. So there's a lot that we can learn across sectors from each other, and I think that's a good place to start.
Absolutely. Jess and Biljana, sorry, did you want to add anything about the primary prevention piece and what we could be doing to shift things now so that we're not having the same conversation in 20, 30, 40 years?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. Oh, sorry, Biljana, do you have something?
No, you go. Yep.
I'll be super brief. So, I think that at the moment, I'd like to see quite a radical rethink about what we define as primary prevention. I think that we do a lot of work on that, on the universal, so that sort of nationwide, all of population, but quite low dose primary prevention, which sometimes becomes more targeted through actual in-person programs, but is often sort of conducted through awareness campaigns in the media. I think so. We focus a lot on that and on the changing of attitudes and norms. But I would really like to see primary prevention start to be much more selective about the groups that it targets. So looking at groups at risk and with potential at being at risk, and then those groups that are at very high risk, including the very large numbers of children who have grown up with family violence and coercive control. And I think that there's a real opportunity for us to consider a pivot at this moment, because we are seeing a kind of stalling in the work of attitude change in terms of the return on investment. And the National Community Attitude Survey did show recently that basically attitudes on domestic violence have stalled since the last survey a few years ago. And I think that, we need to be also doing much more work to connect the children's sector, many of whom are on the call today, with the domestic violence sector, because at the moment they kind of operate on these parallel tracks, but don't often come together. And And I think that's just, I think we'll look back in 10 years, hopefully, and think that was a crazy way to go about things.
Yep. Really important points there about that sort of progressive universalism, in a sense, like making sure that we have other points of intervention that are seen as preventative rather than just looking at that universal system in its own. Biljana.
Yeah, I was hoping Jess would say all that. That's great. You know, I'm very much, we need to support child victims and kids at risk right now better to prevent future harm. If we're not working with current victims of violence at the moment, then they're going to be the adults in our service systems, which is what we all know now. We're working with adults who experienced this in childhood and got no service delivery, and we're still doing it. And so, yeah, I'm with Jess. In 20 years' time, we're going to look back and go, how did we not support the kids that needed it at the time? Because that recovery is prevention, as she said before, and so as Rosie Batty said. So, yeah, that's my...
No, thank you. That is the most sort of insightful point to end on, really. I think that critical takeaway from this whole conversation is about being child-centered, is really about that fact of supporting the children in the here and now and the experiences they're having that is unique to them, and finding that wraparound holistic service that can support their needs while having that broader conversation with society across different institutions, across all the places where children and families intersect, which is really everywhere, and shifting that sort of conversation around gender stereotypes, what domestic and family violence actually looks like, and the impact that it can have. So thank you all for your time. That was really amazing, really interesting conversation. Could keep going all day. So we might need to organise another webinar with the three of you and actually make sure we have the videos working next time. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Really appreciate having you all on and for your questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, and if we can, we'll try to answer some of those in the follow-up email that we send with the links, etc. And I just want to say that in that final point that all, Jess, Moo and Biljana were making about connecting those dots, that's what the call for the National Summit to Prevent Child Maltreatment that NAPCAN made yesterday is really about. It's about bringing those systems together. All those plans need alignment. We need to look at prevention as a thing that is shared across all of these different sectors: health, education, justice, and it does impact employment. And, we need to have different people involved in these conversations. Talking just in child protection or just in the family and domestic violence space isn't getting us the results that we need, and particularly around the prevention piece. So I just want to reiterate that this isn't the end of the conversation. I hope you'll be able to take some of what you've learnt today together forward in your work and be able to apply it. Do feel free to reach out to NAPCAN if you've got further questions or want to connect in some way. We're very happy to support. We'll be posting the recordings to our website and emailing them, as I said earlier. A short survey will pop up when you close the webinar. Do take some time to give us feedback. We'd love to know what you enjoyed and what else you might want to see in the future, or what you might have liked in this conversation today even. So finally, we still have webinars running for the rest of the week. It's not too late to sign up for some more, hopefully the ones that have videos that work. And do go to our website and find out more about the call for a national summit as well. Together, we need to have our voices heard and make sure that governments understand they need to act now. And I think that's all from me. I just want to say have a great day. Thanks for joining the conversation, and do go to the NAPCAN website for further information on the summits and the webinars. Thank you.